Hello everyone and welcome to this week's SharePoint TV. For those of you that it's the first time here, we're really excited to have you. Remember that the goal of SharePoint TV is to have it interactive, not only a 1-hour presentation. This week's will certainly be a bit about content, but a lot about having fun as well. But remember to ask all of your questions in the chat on the right side of your screen. We have a few things to talk about, so let's get started by showing a quick video from our sponsor, Valo Intranet. Okay, welcome back. I see that the video is done. Let's start introducing our two speakers. Todd, Shane, how are you doing?
What up?
Very well. Very well.
Awesome. Let's start a bit with some introduction. I mean, I think almost everybody knows you guys for the good or the bad reasons. We're not going to get in there. And I know this is a risky move, but let's start with Shane.
Oh, well, thank you, Vlad. Thank you very much. And I would like to point out, Vlad, it's been a while since we've seen each other. I don't know. I can't actually think of the last time I saw you in person. But, so I remember you from this beautiful Twitter avatar that you have and on the intro of the show. And now to be here on live with you, man, you're kind of, you must be on Todd's beauty regimen. You are not getting prettier. So,
hey, this is what SharePoint does to you. I heard that's why you switched to doing something else than only SharePoint Admin.
Is that it? Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's it, right? So it was SharePoint Super Nerd for a long time, and now thanks to Power Apps 911, I am now a Power Apps and Power Automate and Power. I don't even know what all those things are, but I've become a super nerd in that space. This had to take SharePoint and take it one more level. So everyone's always asking, how do you make SharePoint cooler, better, more awesome? Well, I got tired of just saying put my picture on the front cover because that does help make SharePoint run better. But so I jumped over to the Power App space where we could start to extend and build on SharePoint a little bit better. So I'm sorry, Todd, are you bored? Would you like to talk about you for a minute?
I didn't know if do we have any time in the show left? I know Shane's been droning on and on and on about himself. Was it time to wrap up? Is it closing credits?
I don't know if you guys watched The Masked Singer, right? But on there, Kim Jong, whatever that guy's name is, right? The guy from Hangover, when he starts talking, they ask him, like, do you get paid by the minute? He just keeps going and going and going. Is that what you're saying is happening here? Is that I just won't let you get a word in edgewise and you just keep talking no matter what you do? Is
you
that
are
what you're
no
really
Ken Jeong. I will tell you that. I will tell you that. So I am Todd Klindt. I am Shane's better half, and been doing the SharePoint and the Office 365 thing for many moons. Yeah. Oh yes, that is.
Picture.
Yeah,
that is so cute. Do you have a matching one in your office, Todd?
I actually have it as my background, my wallpaper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's yeah. And if you look in that picture, you can't really see where my left hand is at. I'll leave that up. With the bigger picture, the print that Shane has on his other wall, there's a little more finer detail, but yeah, it was a special moment. And we've got one of us feeding each other dessert or feeding ourselves dessert with our arms intertwined.
That was the first picture of us ever taken.
Oh, I did not know that it was that auspicious. That is awesome.
Yes.
That is awesome. So I'm a SharePoint guy. I have run SharePoint in production with every version of SharePoint. So the very first version of SharePoint that I admin was SharePoint Team Services, the very first one, and have just been doing them all. And following the crowd, I don't even remember what it was, 5 years ago or something. I started moving into Office 365 and doing that these days, and it's a good time. Good time to be a nerd.
It is crazy how much our lives just have to revolve around. Right, you can't just do SharePoint anymore. You can't just do Exchange. It's really, you get into the Office 365 ecosystem in some way. You've got to be able to speak, and that was kind of how I ended off in this new corner, right? Because I started to poke around the bear a little bit there. So expanding our skill sets is always very important.
Yeah,
that is for sure. And I mean, both of you in a way were the IT pros before. So when you look at kind of the community, there was a few people that were really hardcore IT pros. Todd is still, I think, in that side with me. I still consider myself on the IT pro, even if we're now Office 365. So not only SharePoint anymore, a lot more things. But Shane, you completely left that space. I think I saw somebody told me on Twitter, might have been Todd, but I'm not sure, that you just couldn't do it anymore. Now that you had to do PowerShell and all of those advanced things, you wanted to go into the no code. And that's what the rumor says. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, rumors might be true. So it was interesting, Vlad. I actually tried to transition into being a super PowerShell nerd. I really kind of, so if you go way back, right, 2007, Todd and I walked into an office of Microsoft, and they're like, "Good news, guys, you get to learn PowerShell." And we both cried for a long time.
It was all the stages of grief, the anger, the bargaining. It was pretty ugly.
Yeah, so we were big haters, and it turned out that after years of us, it took us that long to write our first script. Oh. But once we kind of got comfortable with it, we both really took a liking to it. And so I actually tried to move into just being a PowerShell type of consultant, and just couldn't I couldn't get that to land. But I really, you could say I wasn't smart enough for SharePoint anymore. I agree with that. But I tried to make PowerShell a thing, and it just didn't work.
Yeah, you have to be a PowerShell person in a niche. And I think that was the thing that wasn't hitting for you. But I'm with you. I don't know how. We know several PowerShell people, and I'm just not sure how they have monetized that. I would love to talk to them about it sometime.
How do you guys get paid?
How does your family eat? That car you're driving, who pays for it? Yeah.
Yeah, because I have a PowerShell video on YouTube that has almost 1 million views, and I couldn't. I made $5 off of consulting services from 1 million PowerShell views. So it was tough, but and then there was a whole and this is, I think, is you guys have both went through it, right? As we've tried to transition. So we tried to get into Azure AD. That never clicked for me. I think Todd's gotten really good at the Azure AD side of the house.
Yeah, I do a bunch with that.
So there's just all these other things. But then, it's been interesting because, to your point, I mean, Todd and we grew up building server farms and connecting servers and building extranets and, index this and search that, and that's all.
And IIS reset and
yeah, I did some work with a customer this week. I was patching one of their SharePoint on-prem servers, and there was that half a second pause as I was trying to think of answers because I just don't do it so much anymore. But it came back to me. But the IIS reset was one of them. We were running the config wizard. I'm like, oh yeah, this is going to bounce everything. Hold tight.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you the last time I did an IIS reset. I used to do those 7 times a day. So that's.
Yeah, the joke that Shane and I would always tell is that doing an IIS reset was like taking flowers and chocolates to SharePoint. Just puts it in a better mood. Just clears its brain. All is forgiven when you do an IIS reset. So we did that early and often. That was a good tool.
Always forgiven until the next time.
Yeah. So that
it always comes back to you.
Yeah, and that's so I had some flashbacks. So I don't know if you guys have looked at the Power Portals at all, but this whole idea of a website that you kind of build with the Power Platform and make it and authenticate and all that. And I was looking at the pieces, and it felt so much like those early days of when we first started trying bolt FBA and all those pieces into an ADFS into on-prem SharePoint. I had flashbacks. I just can't do this because they have a lot of the same weird plumbing issues right now trying to connect to everything, but doing a poor job of connecting to anything when it comes to the authentication side. So that was the closest a SharePoint on-prem flashback I've had in the last 6 months.
But talking about Power Portals, that's a pretty new thing. I think it just hit GA a few weeks ago at Ignite, I think. Can you just take a step back and explain kind of what they were built for and what's the difference between that and external sharing in SharePoint? Why would somebody go to Power Portals? I know you just said that it's a SharePoint flashback for you, so you don't really like it, but at least try to.
No, it's interesting. So yeah, Power Portals, like you said, they went GA back at Ignite, and so with that, the idea is that so we got Power App Canvas apps. We started making these little apps, right? And like as soon as somebody makes their first app, their next question is, how do I share this externally? And the answer was, for the longest time, you couldn't, which that has mostly been bridged a little bit now. But so in the Dynamics world, which is kind of what sent us down the Power Apps path, Dynamics has had this concept of web portals for a long time, go and kind of stitch together some of those dynamic CDS-driven pieces and make kind of a website extranet type of thing, but surfacing Dynamics or CDS data. So Power Portals is really just taking that and saying, hey, instead of that just being a Dynamics thing, let's turn this into a standalone component of the Power Platform. And so what the idea is you could just make like a straight up website that was anonymous. You can make a authenticated website, but you're using those same Power Apps concepts to kind of drag components like we drug web parts in the SharePoint days onto the screen, and then you can interact with CDS or the Common Data Service data. It has not been, it has not taken off yet. I mean, or at least I haven't been overran with it, so I'm just still trying to kind of figure out what's going on with it. But it's an interesting story. I know there's a couple of big customers that are building like portals, like customer portals. So Virgin, if you have things you want to like log into their system and interact with their profile, the idea is that instead of writing a .NET website, you drag some pieces on there, you connect it up, and it's fed into CDS. So I think that the big difference between that and SharePoint, if you think about SharePoint, right, it's really a collaboration site more than a form type of thing.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'll ask you a trick question, which I'm sure you'll love to talk about. What's the licensing for that? How does that work?
No me gusta.
Todd is happy now.
so Shane got so much attention there, and I was a little jealous, but now you just threw him under the bus, so all is forgiven.
Yeah. So with Power Portals, though, the nice thing is you can buy the licensing. So you can buy it. There's several different ways. You can do per user stuff, or you can do it per like page hit type of thing. So you could just say, I want to buy 10,000 page hits. And so then that way you don't have to worry about named users and that type of stuff. But once again, I don't have anyone who's actually doing it for realsies. Realsies is a word. And so I haven't had to go and solve the last mile of it. But conceptually, you can buy a consumption-based license and make it work.
So depending on the hits. Okay.
Yeah. And, and it's, I will also mention, though, if you're kind of thinking about this whole idea, you like the idea of an extranet form and things, I think Power Portals might be where we end up. But today we have several customers that we're actually using Microsoft Forms, just good old forms, and making those customer facing. You fill out the form, and then we're using Power Automate flows to grab the data and move it into SharePoint or SQL or somewhere like that. And so we've done that for several people to kind of make an externally facing piece.
And I think Forms just does not get enough good press.
Agreed.
By myself included. I still know a bunch of people who do Google Forms because they don't know any better. So yeah, Microsoft Forms, they need to educate people whether that's out there.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's just because they are not monetizing it. That's the reason we don't see much about it. But then there's the Forms Pro now. But I honestly, maybe one of you guys knows, but I don't know what does Forms Pro get me that Forms Not Pro get me?
I don't know.
I think you can save, and don't quote me on that. I'm not a Forms Pro.
This is recorded, so you will be quoted.
No, but I just said, don't trust me. It's like don't trust Todd with SharePoint PowerShell anymore. Don't trust me with Forms and Forms Pro. I think it saves the data into the CDS, and then you can leverage it for other things. I think that was the big difference from what I understood, but I'm not 100% sure. Since I think Forms normal, you just have it in the Excel. You can do flow and other things, but it's not saved in the CDS to integrate with everything else.
Yeah, I think I need to make a video on that for the world, right? Because that's the thing. Yeah, Forms Not Pro It just dumps it into like an Excel basically, right? And you're like, oh, what a pain in the butt. I hate this thing. But it's real super simple to write a Power Automate flow. Oh, you like that Power Automate flow? That is the correct.
Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Just like butter. Just yeah.
But it's real easy to write a flow that will grab that data and then go put it into SharePoint or SQL. I mean, literally, like it takes me 32 seconds to do it. So there's a lot to be, once again, to Todd's point, there's a lot more that people could be doing with forms that they just don't know. And I guess, us being the forms pros, we should be out there, talking more about it.
I think one of the downsides that it's not necessarily one of the downsides I see with forms, you cannot brand it. It still keeps that generic, kind of like Google Forms as well, I think has that same problem that it cannot be integrated into a site and still make it look part of that site. It will always have that forms branding. And I think if they fix that, it might get used a lot more, in my opinion. As again, I work for an internet company, so a lot of it is for branding, right. And a lot of people want that. And I see people are joking a bit here that we should call it Power Forms now instead of Forms Pro.
Oh, I like it.
Power Forms. That's probably
Power Forms.
That's got to be taken. Yeah, and
that's probably got to be with a space. Remember, Power Space Forms.
And Spots brings up in the chat room one of the worst announced things at Ignite was the fact that the product flow was renamed to Power Automate, but the object that Power Automate creates is still called a flow. And they sort of quietly said that in one of the big Power Platform videos, but they didn't hit it very hard. And I remember after the keynote asking a couple of people, like, did they just say that they renamed Flow? And half the people that I talked to were like, no, they would have said that. That would have been a big deal. They'd have been flags. And no, they really did do that. And then one of the quieter ones that Vlad was giving Shane hell about before this was they renamed Power Apps to Power Space Apps. And they didn't really...
So Shane needs a new sticker. Yeah. That's what I know now.
Yeah, and to that point, Todd, what was interesting was, so I got to write one of the articles that got released right when the keynote started, right, with all the talking points. And so I had all of the keynote talking points, and I explained all this in like great detail. And then watching the keynote, and I'm like, you guys didn't say like half the crap that I just said you said. They missed like half of their own talking points. I'm like, right? That's why the article you write, like, oh yeah, I'm watching the keynote now, and I see this, and this, even though you wrote it 3 days ago. And so that was interesting to me also, that they just totally did not talk about things that were bolded in their talking points.
Yeah, that one, I mean, is as hard as they're hitting the Power Platform, to have just glossed over that was just ridiculous, because, and the only reason that I caught it was in one of the demos that they were showing, one of the pre-recorded things. He's like, well, and then I use Power Automate to blah, blah, blah. I'm like, man, do they have another workflow thing now? Because that's exactly what Flow does. And then, I just like slowly, it was
caught up.
Yeah, it was really weird.
Yeah. Well, and their whole idea there with Power Automate, right? So now, as of this moment, you can make classic flows, right? Lowercase f. You can make UI flows, which is that whole robotic process automation, the RPA stuff. You can make business process flows. So that's the idea. And I think that you might even see there's a Power Virtual Agents. I think at one point they were thinking maybe that was going to get stuck into Power Automate, but now I think it's going to be its own thing. So once again, to Vlad's point, right? I understand what they were trying to do, but to Todd's point, the execution was just...
Yeah. It was pretty bad.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break about the Power Platform. And let's actually, maybe for Todd, a question that we had in the chat here.
Yes.
Since it's been silent. Somebody that's been traditional IT pro for on-prem comes back to SharePoint. What should traditional SharePoint IT pro learn nowadays to get back into the game and be the latest and greatest for kind of the new, not only SharePoint, but teamwork world, like say, where we have a bunch of things to manage?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is they'll have to come to terms with the fact that everything's in the cloud now, and that you're not a SharePoint IT pro anymore. You're an Office 365, or I guess we should be saying Microsoft 365. IT pro, and figuring out where all of that is. So, and that's, honestly where I am now. My first love is SharePoint. Every problem SharePoint is the solution for, but now we have to recognize that Teams is a big part of how business works. And so as a, M365 admin, I have to understand what Teams is and how that interacts with things. We talked about Azure AD, all of the different nuances of logins and licenses and all of that. You have to get up to speed on that. And you'd mentioned earlier about PowerShell with SharePoint Server. PowerShell, so somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody at Ignite, somebody from Microsoft, said that Azure wouldn't exist if it weren't for PowerShell. Office 365 wouldn't exist if it weren't for PowerShell. That is the tool that you need these days to do anything at scale. So when we talk about how, Shane and I have been preaching this for a decade now, how everything should be a site collection, everything should scale that way. Now we're, 10 years in, people are having hundreds of site collections without even trying. And the only way to really wrap your head around that is to have these good automation tools like PowerShell. And in Office 365, it's even worse because now anything that you creates an Office 365 group. And so now you've got just these things everywhere. So you have to embrace PowerShell, and just that's got to be your de facto way of doing things. So if somebody's coming back to the fold, I would tell them, dust off those SharePoint Server PowerShell skills, make a couple SP sites, get that, and then download the PNP. I've got a great blog post on all the different PowerShell modules I use with Office 365. Get that thing, load those up, and that is the wave of the future.
I actually saw, I was joking around because there seems to be so many PowerShell modules. I'm not sure if you've seen kind of the fashion was for everybody to do when to use what in Office 365, because we have like 5 apps for chatting, 3 apps for tasks. Now, how many modules? Can you name all of the modules out there that we have for PowerShell, Todd?
Well, I don't have
This is a test, by the way. If you don't get it good, Shane will get you.
Because whenever I have a question about that, I just go to toddklindt.com into my browser, and right at the top, there's a link there for Office 365 PowerShell modules, and I don't even have to remember them. I just click that link, and they're all listed there, and the links to them, and how to install them, and all of that, so you don't even have to commit it to memory.
Okay. There's a much better YouTube video on it.
There's not.
Few things here.
It's all lies.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just think, back to your whole point around the automation in Office 365 wouldn't exist without PowerShell. One of the things that you and I were told many years ago as they were standing up Office 365, transitioning out of BPAWS, was the whole goal was that no human would ever touch anything, right? There would just be PowerShell, oh, this bad thing happened, PowerShell would see the bad thing happen, and then PowerShell would just go fix the bad thing, right? That was their whole design practice, was just automate. Because to your point, to do things at scale, we like to think of scale as being thousands of things. They're thinking millions of people, and that's what they had to do.
Yeah, and if you think about like the largest SharePoint server farm you ever touched, if you think about it, a single farm, maybe 20 servers, but probably 10. That, and a 20 server farm is huge, unimaginable. And to your point, now think of the scale that Microsoft's managing things, tens of thousands, millions of things. And so you have to do all that, the automation. You got to do it that way.
Yeah. Well, and so speaking of, scale and that type of stuff, and our person who asked kind of about what they should know as they're getting back into this, I think one of the things, the advice Todd and I have been giving for, probably 5 years now, is that we really think that everyone in this space should understand Azure AD, right? The more you understand Azure AD, that is just another skill set that if you can bring that to the table, that makes you more valuable in your meetings, your conversations, right? It makes you better at your job. And so, it's another one of those pieces where Azure AD, I don't even understand how the whole world doesn't run on that at this point. They do it at such a different scale and so much better than we could ever imagine now.
Yeah, and I do a conference talk on Azure AD once in a while, and people are coming around. I don't get as many blank looks when I do that talk, but I love talking about a couple of the security things because, you and I were in this boat about the cloud is insecure and everything should be on-prem. And I talk about how these days, Microsoft does security so well, and Azure AD has a couple of great stories about it. And one of them is when LinkedIn, before Microsoft bought them, LinkedIn, one of their backups got out, and all of their usernames and password hashes got out. And Microsoft, Alex Simons on the AD team, published a thing on how they handled that. And they couldn't call LinkedIn out because, again, they were in the process of trying to buy them. But basically talked about all of the proactive things that Azure AD does. You know, they knew the list of people that had been breached before it was made public, but Azure AD had already caught a bunch of those where the usernames and the passwords matched up because of the crazy login things. Nobody's on-prem security guys can do security as well as Azure AD can. It's not even close. No. And, you know, if you need something like MFA, I remember being part of a two-factor login project probably 10 or 12 years ago at a company, and they were installing the little fobs, the RSA fobs and all that. It was like a year-long project, and it was tens of thousands of dollars of equipment and all this stuff. Azure AD, it's a checkbox. And if you've got the right licenses, it doesn't even cost more. It's just a checkbox. So if anybody's out there listening and they need that fuel for Azure AD and move into Office, I've got the link to that link to that article about how they handle the LinkedIn thing. Yeah. It's just amazing. I read it sometimes just to send chills down my spine. It's awesome.
And a good example, something that yesterday I was actually doing a workshop on provisioning. And we talked about MFA as well. On-prem, we used to schedule PowerShell tasks, run on the server, use the SharePoint admin credentials, and it would run, no problem. Now, if you want to do that in the cloud, you have to put it into Azure Functions or Azure Automation. But you shouldn't. I don't even, if you have MFA, you can't. But anyway, you shouldn't put your password in the script, even if it runs in the cloud. But what can you do? You can use an Azure AD app to authenticate. You can have all of the stuff in Azure Key Vault. So even if you're a traditional IT pro and you don't manage identity, there's a ton of things in Azure AD that you need to learn how to use, especially for automation.
Yeah, the Key Vault stuff. And I wrote, I had a customer here 6 months ago that had a process, and I don't want to get into a lot of details, but there was information in Windows AD, which then made its way to Azure AD, that one team owned, and they weren't going to change that information. And the SharePoint team needed that information, but some things changed on it and things sliced a little different way in the user profile service in SharePoint. And so I wrote some PowerShell that did that, pulled the information in from Azure AD, you know, sliced it, diced it, whatever, pushed it into the user profile service. Obviously, running that on my desktop once a day was not a good use of the customer's money. And so I did the thing, wrote an Azure function in PowerShell that was not publicly supported then, but now it is. Saved all the credentials in the Azure Vault, Key Vault there. And yeah, that thing just kicks off in the cloud, runs however long. I mean, that was a lot of fun.
That's, yeah. By the way, Todd, I was looking at your article and it seems to be missing a recent PowerShell module there. Something that you've been a bit involved. I'm not saying your blog is not up to date, but
so that one I should add that one. You're right. You
know what? Which one? I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So at Ignite, they announced our guy we all know, Jeremy Thake. His team announced they are writing a PowerShell module for the graph. And so that is not out there on my blog yet. I should add that. I was waiting for a couple of things, and they're getting close, so I might do it. Vlad, you may have pushed me over the edge on that.
Are you waiting for the prefix?
I'm waiting for the prefix. That's exactly what I'm waiting for. Yep. So that was an interesting one. So, you know, talking about what skills you need. One of the skills you need these days is just to understand what the hell the graph is. Because that is just a thing that on-prem folks have never had any concept or anything with. And so the graph, to put it at a high level, the graph is kind of a unified API for all of the different resources in Office 365. I'm going to do a terrible job explaining it. One of my favorite videos is at Ignite, Jeff Snover, who is the father of PowerShell.
But I thought that's what Shane is here for. Oh, you try, and Shane will actually explain it properly after now.
Yeah, good. Shane, by all means, start Googling graph now so that when I'm done, you can But Jeff Snover, the father of PowerShell, he is now on the Office 365 team doing some of the AI stuff, and part of that is the graph. And so he's got a really great short video from Ignite that I'll link in Twitch right now, that talks about what the graph is and what the substrate is, and they're kind of separate things. But the graph is essentially an API that will give you a one-stop shop to all of the different pieces of information in the substrate in Office 365. So your user information and documents and calendars, anything that's an object in Office 365 as part of that substrate is now exposed through the graph. And then the graph can be accessed by any kind of application. That can be Exchange or Outlook, I guess, SharePoint, PowerShell, whatever. And so this is one of those things where, we joke, and I've got this web page that has all these modules because you can only get this information from the Exchange module and only get this information from the Azure AD module and all of that. The graph is giving me this glimmer of a dream that there will be one module and one place to hit all of that because it will all be exposed through the graph.
No way.
So, yeah. Well, and in the chat room, there's a couple of questions here I wanted to hit. So yeah, somebody was asking about the MSOL. So Mark Christian was talking about that. So the MSOL module hit Azure AD, and that's been replaced by the Azure AD module. And then there's the Azure AD preview module, and then soon to be the graph module. But that just speaks to the thing that all this information's out there, and there's different ways to get into it. So you find whatever one works the best. So you covered that.
But you see, I kind of don't agree with you that the graph will be the only module you'll need. In a way, I understand why in a perfect world, everything would be available via the graph. So you'd be able to do everything in there. But I think today, a lot of things, especially maybe for the new products, yes, that were built after the graph got invented. But if you look at SharePoint, I don't think everything is in the graph yet, especially on the tenant admin side. It still see some calls that it does in the back. So maybe in the future, but I don't think this module today will be able to be that holy grail.
Yeah, and that's a good point because this product Office 365 is constantly growing. So there are landmarks before graph, after graph, and all that. So anything that existed before graph wasn't built with the graph in mind. But I can tell you, so Zach Rosenfield had a session at Ignite too, and he was talking about this exact thing. And for SharePoint, for that specific example, they really want you to use the graph. And so anytime you're like, well, but I can't because there's this thing that I have to use CSOM for, so I'm going to keep using CSOM and overloading your servers. That kind of thing is exactly the thing that makes him go, oh crap, we need to get that into the graph. So he quits using CSOM, because once they build it into the graph, then they can introduce the throttling and the pagination and all of that and make it hurt their servers less. Whereas if you and I start hitting the, list ASPX, things like that, list ASMX, that potentially hurts their server. So they are very motivated to get it all in the graph.
I just wish, we just opened up the show with the whole renaming, joking stuff. And why can't they rename the graph? I mean, everyone that I introduced the graph to, they're like, well, what does this have to do with building graphs? I'm like, nothing. The name is terrible. I think that's like its first problem, right? If they would just be like, call this, the Office 365 Glue API, everybody would, understand right away, because that's the way I always explain it. Right? When SharePoint and Exchange want to talk to each other, they just talk via the graph. They just have these little, calls there, but people are like, what does a graph have to do with it? Nothing. I hate the graph. So, I don't know.
We're joking about renames. There's actually been, so we used to have multiple graphs. We had the Office graph, we had the Yammer graph, I think, we had the Azure graph. And if you look on the PowerShell gallery, there's like a community-made PowerShell module for all of them. And now they renamed all of them together to Microsoft Graph. So,
so Shane, I think graph is a little g thing, not a big G thing. Like Jeff Collins in the chat room is saying, graph is the name that many companies call their thing that does this. Like Facebook has their own graph, Microsoft has a graph. I just ran across another one. So I think the graph is like a mathematical thing or something. Somebody will have it. So I think that's the problem, is Microsoft took the indistinct word for it instead of giving it a product name. And that's where we're stuck. And another question in the chat room, so Fred 18 asked, is Graph an evolution of Delve? Delve was a consumer of the graph data, And that was kind of the first showcase, the whole Project Oslo thing that they released, however many years ago. So Delve was an example of having this unified API that was the graph that SharePoint could consume, but could go out and read your user data in Azure AD, see who your manager was, see who your coworkers were, then take that data and look in SharePoint and see what documents those people were looking at, and look in Exchange and see that kind of stuff. So that was their first, here's some of the crazy stuff our graph can do.
Yeah. So, So two things there. So one, the Microsoft, they named it Microsoft Graph API with a capital G because the marketing people got a hold of it. So, but the second one, just because we haven't mentioned it yet, if you guys are like really like, what is this graph thing? How do I get started with it? If you use Bing and search for Microsoft Graph Explorer, they will take you to a lovely little website where they have prepackaged queries. They can let you log in and then kind of help you understand and get going there. And so a lot of times when I first want to go use a new part of the graph on something I haven't used before, I start with the Graph Explorer. It's just it's a pretty good website, other than it has the G capitalized, which goes against, whatever. But
yeah, and so right now I've been playing with the Graph PowerShell for a couple of months now, and it is so the Graph PowerShell is automatically generated. It's not interns at keyboards. It uses a thing called AutoRest that actually queries the API and builds commands based off of the endpoints inside of the API, which sounds efficient and great, but it is. I mean, the end result is horrible right now. They've got some tweaking. So Vlad mentioned the prefix thing. We can touch on that in a minute, but that's a vestige of that. But as I'm trying to figure the Graph PowerShell out and give them feedback on what doesn't work the way that it should, the Graph Explorer, I always have that up in a window, and I'm always walking through and clicking stuff so I can see what the output's supposed to look like and what the graph has in the background. The Graph API the Graph Explorer is invaluable.
And I think the advantage, because there's an advantage for it being auto-generated, which I think, there's advantages and disadvantages, of course. The advantage is that it's always going to be up to date. The whole idea is, the team adds, like, say, the presence API in the graph, which is something that happened last week. It will automatically generate a PowerShell commandlet for it, so we're going to be able to use it in PowerShell.
Yeah.
So that's going to make, you don't need an engineer to go code a new commandlet that calls the APIs. The disadvantage is, I guess, the documentation and
there's many disadvantages. Yeah. So one of the disadvantages with the auto-generated thing is for SharePoint Online, there is a module, and it's got 150, 200 commandlets, something like that. I forget. You can't do anything without the PNP module, and I forget that's got 300 some commandlets, something like that. The PowerShell Graph API has 80 modules and over 2,000 commandlets. And to give you an example of how ridiculous and unnecessary that is, OneNote, there are over 700 commandlets in that 2,000 that deal with OneNote. That is unnecessary. So that is one of the pieces of that puzzle. I agree that the keeping it up to date with AutoRest, you can add prefixes and collapse things. They need to put some time into that to make this manageable, because PowerShell is tough to get your head wrapped around in the first place. But when you're trying to comb through 2,000 commandlets, you'll never find it.
Oh yeah, but it allows you to do a lot of end user stuff. So let's say create a task in somebody's Outlook, send a message in a team. I didn't even look into OneNote once, to be honest, but imagine using PowerShell to add stuff in a OneNote. That's pretty cool at large for automation.
I agree. So, and OneNote was one that I picked out because as I was trying to find commandlets, it kept showing. So I just did, get command star OneNote star .count, and it was 700 and something. So I think, I don't want to say that all 700 of those things aren't good, but they may not all need to be their own individual commandlet. Maybe they can put parameters on a commandlet or something. And that's why, Daryl Miller is one of the guys I've been working with a lot. That's why they're soliciting input from folks like us. There's a GitHub project. I linked it in the Twitch, and I'll update my blog post. They have been incredibly responsive on issues. And the prefix one is an interesting one. So for anybody that's done PowerShell, when you do PowerShell, all the commands are verb-noun. And then the general convention that Microsoft themselves has promoted is that the noun should have a prefix based on whatever project it is. So, what's a user? Well, a user could be an AD user. It could be a local Windows user. It could be a SharePoint user. So you've got get SP user, get AD user, get MSOL user, whatever. Prefixes on the nouns. The Graph API folks did not put a prefix on their nouns. And so, as you can imagine, with those over 2,000 commandlets, there was some collisions. And for me specifically, ShareGate had a get group because they also don't use prefixes. And the
Teams
Graph
as
one
well, I think.
Teams is another one. Yep. So get group would clobber over, and I couldn't get groups. And so I went back to Daryl and Jeremy, and I had a list of things, and that prefix thing was one of them. And they said, well, we talked to some of the engineers about it, and they claim they talked to Jeff Snover about it. I think they were just name dropping. I think they walked past him in the hall or maybe saw him out a window, and they were,
hi, Jeff.
Yep. And they're like, we don't think it's necessary. I'm like, well, you're absolutely wrong, but okay. And then they published the GitHub thing at Ignite, and it exploded, and there was a whole bunch of complaints about the prefixes. And they came back and they said, yeah, we were happy telling Todd he's full of crap, but you guys, we trust you, and they're going to add a prefix now. So going out to GitHub and giving good, respectful feedback, they're listening to it, and they're making the product better. So I encourage people to do that.
But yes, that was my first reaction when Daryl showed it to me. He's like, hey, do you want to talk? And he showed it to me in private, and he showed me the first commandlet. My first reaction was, no prefix?
Yeah.
That's the first thing I said. And before running into the problems installing it, because of the Teams module already installed and things like that. But even the Teams PowerShell module at some point is get team. So is that considered a prefix?
No, that's the noun. That's the object. It's getting a team.
So the other one, it has like get teams user. So some commandlets have the prefix, some of them don't. Exchange Online hasn't been good at it either. Get user, get mailbox, things like that. So I really hope they're all going to move that way.
Yeah. And in the chat room, so Mark Christian asked, will non-privileged users be able to use this? Absolutely. And that is one of the infuriating things about the graph, but also one of the more powerful things is the ability to scope who can get access to what. And so, yes, I assume that regular users will be able to get in and use the graph, but the graph will respect all the security stuff. So they'll be able to use it to do whatever they want to do with the things they could already do stuff with, but they're not going to be able to use it to go in and look at Shane's inbox and see all the love letters he's been writing me or anything like that. But yeah, I think it'll be there.
They might not return anything, but
exactly. So the other thing I would just mention as we're talking about the graph, right? I'm going to do my job, and so remind everyone that a lot of the times, I'm getting choked up. I'm so excited to get to talk finally.
Those love notes, yeah.
I'll get to you after, but
But so Power Automate with flows, you can connect to the Graph API. So a lot of times, if you go into Power Automate to write a SharePoint thing to do this or that, if it's not a built-in action, you can do it via the Graph API. So since I'm not doing as much PowerShell anymore, I've been using the Graph API same way, just calling it over from Power Automate instead of PowerShell these days. So
I hate to ask you a kind of licensing question again, Shane, but it's not detailed licensing.
Get him, Vlad. Get
him. So rude.
Okay, so January 14th, something will get enabled with Power Platform licensing. And that is, oh, you seem confused. I don't like it. Self-service buying for licensing in the Power Platform. Do you want to talk a bit about how that will work and what are the reasons behind that? Not whether you agree or you can say whether you agree or not with it as well. But
well, I think that's the problem here, right? Is I like the idea, so most people who talk about it are very against this idea. And those of you that don't know, so Microsoft had previously announced that they were going to enable so that users could buy their own Power Apps license, right? So they go in, try to do something with Power Apps need premium, and they'd be like, well, IT won't give it to me. Here's my credit card number. Boop, 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 boop. And then they would be able to just buy their own Power Apps license to start taking advantage of the premium features. So it was supposed to launch back in November, I think, and Everyone like Vlad complained a whole bunch, and they said, "Oh, Vlad's not happy," so they pushed it back to January. I didn't know. That's why I was so confused when you asked the question. I didn't know January 14th was the new date because I am very pro this, right? So people like Vlad, I'll let you defend. You can tell us why you don't like it. What I like about it is, what we have seen in the Power Platform is probably it was higher, but I'd say right now somewhere between 70 to 80% of my customers are not IT. They are business owners, they are business users, they are, Janie from accounting who just needs to write herself a little app to replace that stupid spreadsheet she's been using for many years. And so those are the people that are driving all the success in the Power Platform today. And for a lot of them, IT is just doing the standard talk to the hands, right? We're not going to help you. We're not going to engage with you. Leave us alone. So that's okay. Janie has the license. Janie is building her apps today. But now Janie wants to go the next step. She wants to incorporate the AI features, or she wants to move to a better platform, or she wants to do external sharing, right? She wants to do something that requires that next level of licensing. And once again, IT is like, Power what? And so enabling Janie to buy her own license because she's the one that knows what the hell's going on, I am 100% for it. Your counterpoint, Mr. IT.
I was gonna let Todd, if Todd has anything. If not, I'll step in.
So I am 75% for it, which hurts my heart because I like to be 0% for anything you are in favor of. So this is really, I'm having a lot of soul searching going on right now. It's like I don't know myself. So one of the things that made me fall in love with SharePoint 100 years ago was the thing that you just talked about, that once IT stood a site up or did whatever, Janie in accounting could go out and add web parts and do whatever. And that was great. I like playing solitaire. I like watching funny cat videos on the internet, and those two things work together really well. And, the Power Platform is a vast extension of that. And I think, democratizing that is a great thing. I agree with all your pieces. I think we should let that out there. I think when Microsoft announced this, their tools for governing it or making it noticeable, exposable by IT weren't where they needed to be. And I think that's the piece they have to address. And I think they're getting there by putting a big master switch. I think they need to dial that back a little bit, but just make it easier for IT to keep track of.
Yeah, okay. And see, so here's my problem with governance, right? So no, Vlad, you have to wait.
I'll wait.
Here's the problem with governance, right? Is we have not governed how people have used Excel spreadsheets or access databases.
That doesn't mean we shouldn't have. It just means we couldn't.
But I mean, imagine how much, right? Your wife's an accountant, right? Imagine if we took the ability for her to create her own Excel spreadsheets away, and she had to go to IT every time she'd want an Excel spreadsheet over the last 10 years.
Yep.
Her company would be in the Stone Ages, still on pen and paper, and it would not be the
tables and mm-hmm.
Right. So so it wasn't possible, and so that's what people are missing, I think, with Power Apps. When we're talking about someone like Janie going and building her own solution to solve this problem, right? She doesn't get any new access. She doesn't have permissions to things she didn't have permissions to do before. She's just the same way she built an Excel spreadsheet. She wants to build a Power App now. I hate that people try to govern that. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Now,
go ahead. I was going to say, I agree that it is not empowering Jamie to do anything she couldn't do before. And so that's it. But this is like the old Napster argument. Like Napster did not allow us to do anything we couldn't do before. We could already share music with our friends. That was not anything that Napster, but Napster allowed us to do it much faster on a much bigger scale. And and I see this as the same way, that Janie can only do the things that she could do before, but the Power Automate tools allow her to do it faster and at a bigger scale. IT just needs to know that's going on.
And I guess the problem comes is, the small companies I'm working with, it's going great. I mean, literally, like I work with CEOs of $100 million construction companies. They're like, our IT is a pain in the butt. I don't want to work with them. Help me build this app. But then, so big publicly traded security company, we've been building apps there for about 2 years, and they've gotten this great groundswell of, they've got enabled all these new business solutions. And they love it. And so then IT finally got tired of hearing about the fact that this guy over in this random department was doing it. So IT's like, well, here we come. And so now to build an app for 5 people, they have to fill out a 13-page governance document.
Yeah, that's wrong.
Right. And that's the problem, right? But IT, that's their traditional thing. We completely I was in IT, right? I was the IT guy. I get it.
Yep.
We completely over-rotated to we're just going to control this thing. That same customer, and I'll stop talking, let Vlad have his turn, but that same customer, they came to us and said, hey, we want to build this app to do this complex business process for blah, blah, blah. And we're like, all right, we think it's going to cost about 40 grand, right? All in, it's going to take you about 40 grand. Or here's how many hours it would take you to build it yourself. I don't remember the number I would tell you. It was a really big number, way bigger than 40 grand worth. And then they took that same app to IT and said, hey, IT, what if we had you build it? IT's like, well, we can start on it in 9 months. It'll be 170 grand.
And then we'll never touch it again, and you won't be able to fix it.
Oh my God! I mean, right? That's where this is all broken, and it drives me bonkers.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet now.
Okay, so let me I'm not saying I disagree with all of the pro-user stuff you guys said. So I agree with that part. I think one of the problems with the announcement originally, before it got moved to January 14th, is that there was no way for IT to actually turn it off. There was no way for IT to get notified when a user purchases a license. So IT was completely cut out of the loop. Now at least they actually added a new PowerShell module to block that IT can block people from doing self-service per app. So you can block self-service only for Power Apps, only for Flow. I think the stuff we're missing right now is the proper admin tools for Power Apps and for Power Automate. If you look at and I'm going to keep calling it Flow, I'm sorry, Microsoft marketing. But if you look at the Flow Admin Center, if a user creates a flow, let's say a user goes on their cells, creates a flow from their department, and becomes, I'll take accounting, becomes a critical accounting workflow. That user, maybe they did a great job. They didn't share it with anybody. It remains under my flows, right? Because it's not shared with anybody. That user leaves the company. I disable their account. That flow is gone. We now have a business critical process that stopped working because IT was not involved in a way. IT is not aware of it. So I really think we just need to have better admin tools before we enable that kind of things of being that business critical.
So two things there. So one, there is a way for IT to know about it, right? You can write a flow or PowerShell that audits and gets a query of all the flows running, and it can set IT as a secondary owner even. So you could automate all that. But the other one, so jumping further back in the conversation, your idea that IT doesn't know that the software is being purchased, but IT doesn't know if I go buy Dropbox, IT doesn't know if I go buy Teams, right?
Right, so, but we all agree that that's bad.
But it's the world we live in, and so here's the problem, right? So now we're putting Microsoft under a different set of rules, right? You have to know if you buy Microsoft stuff, but not if you buy Dropbox.
No. We're putting Microsoft into the same rules that we wish we could put Dropbox on, but we just can't. Like nobody is saying we don't care if you buy Dropbox, but we care. They're saying we can't figure out you're buying Dropbox, but if we could, we would sure drop it. We would sure block it.
Yeah, I mean, right now we're saying it's good to have Shadow IT in Microsoft. It's still better to have Shadow IT inside Microsoft than have Shadow IT somewhere else.
And I agree with that.
We just have to remember users always take the path of least resistance, right?
They just want to get their jobs done.
If we block them from using Power Apps with all of these new lockdowns, which is what a lot of companies want to do, right? I'm not saying you guys are advocating it, but a lot of companies do. Like, you're just going to lock this thing out. There's 5 competitors to it that they can just go buy on their corporate credit card. And so then now they've got your data in some third-party safe data center, right? You've completely lost any insight, any control, or the umbrella of at least knowing that Microsoft is helping to secure the data, because you've pushed them, because they go to the path of least resistance, you push them straight out the door to the other products.
Yeah, and I agree that's bad. I agree we should do everything we can to empower the user.
Yeah,
as long as we keep track.
That we can all, I think that we can all agree on. Maybe just not on the exact way to do it. But if you two guys agreed, I would be a bit worried, to be honest.
Yeah, that's fair, right? I mean, you got 2 talking heads, or 3 talking heads with your dumb butt on here. So,
Hey, I had to fit in with you guys. So
so you dumbed it down for us. We appreciate that.
Anytime.
And we're gonna have to kick Lori out of the chat room because she's saying that Shane's speaking the truth and she's taking her side.
Go Shane, go Shane.
I've had it. I'm sick of it. So
I know she's been basically just agreeing with Shane for an hour.
And it makes me sick. If I'd had lunch today, I would be. So whoever's moderating that channel, kick Lori out. I've had it.
But I think we're getting to the top of the hour. I shared in the chat the PowerShell script. For those of you that want to turn it off, you can turn it off. For those of you that want to leave it open like Shane, you can leave it open. You just have to not do anything. It's going to be open by default, starting with Power BI on January 14th. And I guess the other ones will follow shortly. But before we announce the guests for next week, we actually have a video from our sponsor, SharePoint Conference, a video with Todd inside that he doesn't remember actually filming. So I wish we still had the camera on while he saw it to remember what he said. But let's roll the video.
I am Todd Klindt. I work for some Praxis Consulting. I am a longtime SharePoint MVP and a lover of all things Office 365. So the thing that makes the SharePoint conference so special is the SharePoint community. I've been at other industry events, I'm not going to name them, but they never felt as friendly. I never felt as comfortable there. It's just a much tighter community, and that really helps with the technology because it's easier to, there's not egos to worry about. It's easy to ask questions of people and ask for help. Conferences like this cover the width and breadth of SharePoint, and so you get exposed to things that you didn't know that even existed, or you see things you knew existed in a different light. And you got the Microsoft people here, so you can ask the people that work on the product, and then you've got people like me, people who don't work for Microsoft and can give you a different version of the answer. So it gives you this ability to see pieces of the product to get you excited about new functionality that you can bring back to your own office. I think anybody who touches SharePoint should come to the SharePoint conference. They've got a wide variety of speakers in a wide variety of areas. I'm an admin, so I notice all those sessions, but there's sessions for developers and business users. If SharePoint is important to your environment, if you're using Office 365 and SharePoint every day, you should be at the SharePoint conference because there's something here for you. You're gonna come out of here a better person. The vendor floor I really like because there's always new vendors that I don't know about. There's always somebody offering some new thing, and oftentimes it's something that I didn't know I needed. I can't imagine not coming to the SharePoint conference every year. As soon as they announce the date, it gets blocked out in my calendar. It is the event to go to. I leave exhausted and just beaten and just like a little glow inside. You gotta be here.
Before we announce next week's guest, just wanted to share with everybody here, we talked a bit about the Power Platform and how to do things right. This way, IT doesn't have to shut you down. Shane has some amazing training on the Power Platform, so I'll let him talk about it a bit.
Yeah, well, I was just a real quick one to let you all know. So I wrote a class that is 100% Power Apps for SharePoint people. That's literally what I called it before our marketing people told me I wasn't allowed to call it that. It's SharePoint peeps. But yeah, I wrote a class. You know, obviously I've written 6 SharePoint books and I've done SharePoint since the beginning of time. So I took all that and wrote a Power Apps class that is focused purely on that audience. So I just want to kind of share that with all of you. You were the people I was thinking of when I wrote the class, so I thought it'd be helpful to share all that. So
awesome. Well, thank you, Shane. And I see the chat, the link is in the chat. And for once, I'm going to say, listen to Shane and check it out. Don't listen to Todd, who said don't click on that. Hey, I have to be equal here.
Don't encourage him, Vlad. I thought you and I were friends. When I see you tomorrow, if I just walk over and kick you in the shin and walk off, that's why.
I'll know why. Okay, perfect. At least I'll know why. And now I see we're at the top of the hour, 1 minute over. So thank you all for joining us. Remember that you can follow the channel on Twitch. To the top right of your screen, you're going to see a heart there that you can click on so you get notified. No, yeah, it's over there. That shows it the right way, I think. But top right, when you look at the screen, don't look at Shane and Todd. You're going to get confused. And next week, we're still going to talk about the Power Platform, but a lot more about Power BI. And we got Jason Himmelstein and John White. Me, Jason, and John are the 3 smallest guys in the SharePoint community. So that'll be a really interesting talk. But yeah, looking forward to see all of you next week, and thank you very much for attending.
Bye, everybody.
See ya.